What has the party been up to for the last 70 years in Xinjiang, the far western, historically Turkic and Muslim province of China? This book answers that question, and if you're looking for a Chinese language accessible overview to the controversies produced in that region, here you go. The author is a professor and academic at Hosei University, and the sources are primarily published documents from the Chinese government itself. If you care a lot about this topic and want to engage with it, go read the book, but here I will just foreground a few points that struck me. Unlike a lot of academics writing in English, the author here is willing to be a bit more controversial even on the front cover. The subtitle asks, is transforming the Uyghurs into members of the Chinese nation constitute a form of cultural genocide? And that is the positive and the negative framing of the same kind of process, which is the subject of a number of the later chapters. The photograph on the cover up top is an illustration of just this sort of thing. We see the Uyghur man walking by murals, the one on the left showing a bunch of Uyghur people reading the Constitution, presumably learning about it, and on the right there are slogans about becoming part of the Chinese people. The subtitle further mentions three concepts: liberation, self-government, or sometimes autonomy, and poverty alleviation. And those are sort of three catch-all terms for policy frameworks that have been used by the party in this region. The author's academic wheelhouse is really in Soviet cultural and political institutions and their influence on both China and Japan. And so there's quite an interesting early discussion about the establishment of Xinjiang as a so-called autonomous region in 1955. It's the first one that's created during the People's Republic. And it was not clear at first how this would go. There was the possibility of following a more Soviet model, which would have created a system that looked a little bit more maybe like federal republics. Now, obviously, the party would have been in charge and Xinjiang would have reported up to Beijing, but maybe something that would have resembled more closely Soviet Central Asia. Of course, that did not happen, and that is sort of an alternate history. And history, the last 70 years, of course, are kind of the point of this book, and that things haven't always been as bad as they've become, and there's a lot of change and difference over time. The author points to the early period in the 1950s when the party spent a great deal of time and investment in training up local ethnic cadres, that is, people who were Uyghur or from other local Turkic groups. These local ethnic cadres had genuine say and agency, and if you're Chinese, you can probably, think of some of the more famous people that emerged from this group. This is, of course, also a smart policy that we see around the world for dealing with ethnic minorities of a kind of, divide and conquer system where you want to raise up an elite that identifies with you and your interests for controlling a region to which you maybe are the new ruler. And this is not so dissimilar from the British or anyone else. And as recently as even the 1980s, things were pretty good, at least in comparative terms, as the author depicts them. And there were a few different reasons for this. One was a sense of Sino-Soviet competition, right? And that in addition to, of course, having these local ethnic cadres who had a say, people up in Beijing understood that there were continuing historic connections between the elites of Xinjiang and their neighbors in Central Asia. And so the party and China had to provide for them in a way that would compare favorably with things going on in the other stands, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and so on. And parenthetically, the author also argues that in the 1980s, to a very great degree, the population in Xinjiang, one could argue, was more internationalized than even Han Chinese people living on the East Coast, and that was because of these kind of connections that they had to the world over their close borders. Now, of course, over all these years, this whole time, there are still going to be periodic outbreaks of unrest, and that was going on, the author shows, again and again for different sorts of reasons, long before the appearance of Salafism, which is what some people attribute the current problems to. The problem of the real breakdown in ethnic relations is complex, and I'm simplifying, but the author highlights a couple of factors, both of which really go back to the party itself and its policy choices. And so if this is something that you care about, you might read and pay attention and think about how things might be changed for the better. One fundamental issue was the sidelining and disempowering of the ethnic cadres who get replaced by their Han Chinese counterparts. A second issue is what we might call intra-party democracy. That's the ability to pipe up with dissent and alternate views to discuss some of the structural factors that are producing social unrest. Here I want to pause for a moment and talk about the sincere, non-cynical Han Chinese cadre deputed to Xinjiang to do work. These people would tell you and would believe in their hearts that they are doing what is right for the benefit of Xinjiang and its people. The issue arises in that form of help is always self-centered and Han-centered, and often defined in very economistic terms. If you're familiar with any kind of critique of a colonial relationship of power, you would basically see something similar here. And of course, these Han cadres then are very angry that people aren't grateful. Why can't they see that what I'm doing is for their own damn good? A final point before I return to the provocative subtitle is the author explains how, in the years after 2000, the Chinese state decided to wholeheartedly follow the Americans and adopt a framework of terrorism and counterterrorism and read that backward into the past to explain what they were up to in Xinjiang. I think there are some uncomfortable conversations and analogies to be made here. You're probably familiar with the ways in which visitors from the Third Reich wanted to study and admire America's Jim Crow and race-based segregation rules, and of course they adopted it for Germany. And here we see much the same thing. America provided great inspiration and more than a little rhetorical cover for what the Chinese state has gone on to do. And so if you are at all uncomfortable with how America framed the so-called war on terror, you have to be critical of this as well. But now to this question from the cover of the process that we're looking at, and is the transformation of Uyghurs into members of the Chinese nation, in fact, a cultural genocide? The author's answer is yes, but with nuance. The nuance, briefly, is that it's not a campaign of extermination, but of assimilation. In this respect, it resembles more, let's say, something like ethnic cleansing or, the Canadian-American or whatever treatment of indigenous peoples. The Germans, in other words, were not pulling people out of their Eastern European shtetls, insisting that they speak High German, appreciate Wagner, and declare a love for pork sausage. And so if your view of what a genocide has to look like is something along the lines of Auschwitz, then that's not what you're going to see. But if that is what you're trying to do, then, you're wrong. And not just because many decades have passed and we're in a different place, but for a reason that I think I was way too subtle about in my previous video. And that is that the Auschwitzian model for genocide, if applied in many places, would find large swathes of the Holocaust itself not to constitute genocide, because maybe they didn't involve technology or complete extermination or bureaucracy or whatever. This was at root what I was getting at with my maybe too flippant reference to the Armenians and the extent to which they have often a hard time getting people to accept their tragedy as a genocide for this very kind of reason. Now, in this video, I've been doing my best to faithfully present the arguments of this book, which is soberly, moderately argued by a scholar with lots of evidence. If you want to learn more about that, you can engage with this book. For my own part, I want to conclude on a slightly different note with what I think is a broader issue that is not taken up and probably couldn't be in this particular book itself. And that is that from the days of empire to the present, China has had to shift from a kind of pluralistic self-concept of its identity to a much more narrow one that is rooted in nationalism. And this was agreed upon, really, by the communists and the nationalists in both the Republic and the People's Republic of China. This kind of nationalism, borrowed from Japan and the West, fits poorly with China's own history and traditions. It has also, in my opinion, and I think many people would agree, been a baleful and distorting force in its politics. The biggest question, therefore, is can we do better and pioneer a vision that is not old and half borrowed from someone else, but consonant with China's own unique situation.